All right, welcome guys. Here we are. So I guess this is how we're going to do it from now on. I'm going to record these videos. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope everyone's family is doing well. Everyone's healthy and working through this transition to online learning. I know it can be difficult trying to juggle numerous classes with online learning instead of being able to go to class and ask questions and maybe hear from your peers. Hey, don't forget on Monday we have this due. Don't forget about this. We got a test coming up. So that's not really gonna be going on anymore, and not only in this class but in any of your classes. So it may be difficult to stay on top of things. So I suggest that to really get a calendar going, get an agenda going so that you have everything organized and you know what is expected of you and when things are due. I'm going to continue to post checklists so that that can help you as well. Email me with any questions if you have any about what's going on, what's coming up. I have no problem answering you back as always. We've talked a lot about evolution, and we are going to continue to talk about evolution in the coming weeks, and then we're going to get into really ecology and community relations and population dynamics that go on once we move away from looking at genetics and evolution. So this part of the course, I think, to me is a lot more tangible and possibly easier to understand because it's not as abstract to people. So as we move forward, hopefully you guys do better. Obviously now, the exams are going to be online, so maybe that'll be beneficial to you. I don't know, we'll have to see, but hopefully you're still studying and putting the time in that's necessary in order to be successful so that you don't have an issue moving forward. Um, this week we continue with evolution. So we've talked about the main idea of evolution, both microevolution, macroevolution, what is going on on the smaller scale, on the larger scale. What influence did Darwin have on that, and what do we see moving forward now that we've really been able to put genetics into evolution and kind of merge them. Remember, once upon a time that we had Mendel and we had Darwin, and they were kind of doing their own thing. We didn't really know how they affected each other, but we knew that they both had good ideas going on at the time back in the 1850s that we're talking about. And now that we've been able to merge them, we see that they really go hand in hand, and it's hard for us to separate them. So in the textbook, if you look at chapter 51, you should have read 51.4, and it says that genetic variation underlies the evolution of particular behaviors such as selfish or selfless behavior. So a lot of times people talk about this whole idea of selfless behavior or altruism being um, having kind of the population in mind when you are moving throughout life. So as much as we always like to talk about the self and being selfless and what it is to evolve and why what you're going to do in order to pass on your genes, because that's what it's all about. We want to pass on our genes, and in order to pass on our genes, we need to reproduce, and that's really what it's all about. It's not so much about being the best looking or being the smartest or strongest, but being fit enough to reproduce. But then we have all of these scenarios where people talk about altruism or this selfless behavior, opposed to this idea of being selfish, where typically you would think that being selfish is beneficial or more beneficial, but really we see these ideas of when is it beneficial to be selfless. Now, when we talk about being selfless or altruistic, you have to keep in mind that it is still something that has an underlying selfishness. So as much as you want to think of altruism as being a completely selfless thing, you're putting someone else's needs in front of yours. It really is going to have some underlying selfishness that's going to be beneficial to that altruistic individual. If that is not there, then that's not going to exist. There would be no reason for us to have genes that are going to make us truly altruistic, completely selfless, and not look out for ourselves at all. So we have these master regulatory genes that can control many behaviors by directing the expression and activity of many genes with narrower functions. For example, you have a single gene that controls many behaviors of the male fruit fly courtship ritual. So just like we looked at those Hox genes that are going to really create the body plan for us, and you have one little gene can really throw off the entire body plan. So you think of, we would have all these different genes for all the different components to our body, but in order to put them together correctly, we need that Hox gene that's going to be able to do that. Well, the same thing goes for when we talk about something with particular behavior. So with these behaviors, you can have one single gene that can really flip the script on specific behavior. So in this example, they talk about the fruit flies and courting between the fruit flies, between males and females, and the ritual that the males have. So variation in the activity or amount of the gene product can have a large effect on the behavior. So now you see where the genes are going to influence the behavior, and the genes influencing the behavior is obviously going to interact with the environment. That's where we see that the genes are really interacting with the environment and influencing evolution. So for one example, you have male prairie voles that pair bond with their mates and provide care to their offspring. So you have male meadow voles that do not. So you have these prairie voles and these meadow voles, and these two types of moles are going to have different types of behaviors. And an expression of just one receptor gene, and when we talk about receptor genes, now we're talking about the influence that genes can have on an entire organ system, the influence that it'll have on, for this example, the endocrine system. So anytime we're talking about hormones, remember they are chemical messengers, and we have our endocrine system that we're talking about. So this receptor gene that is going to influence ADH, or the antidiuretic hormone, or sometimes you hear people call it vasopressin. A lot of times I always hear people talk about ADH, but all of these things are talking about the same thing. And it determines which behavioral pattern is going to develop in these voles. So one little gene is going to influence this entire organ system, which is going to change the way that it interacts in its environment, and then can influence the evolution of that particular organism. So there you got a nice little picture for you of these little voles like a mouse. So when behavioral variations within a species corresponds to that environmental variation, it may be evidence of past evolution. It may convey that, hey, there is something going on where it was beneficial to these organisms for one of the organisms to not um, help with the offspring, and another one it might have been beneficial for it to help with the offspring. So two similar organisms, but they have different behaviors and they have different genes which are going to influence that behavior because of their interaction with their environment, because of the evolution. So a case study that they talk about in the textbook is the natural diet of these western garter snakes varies by the population, and you have these different populations that are going to have different diets. And they actually see that there is a genetic basis behind that. So the ones that have the genes for being in the coastal population, that coastal population, they have their own set of genes, and they feed mostly on banana slugs. And there's a lot of banana slugs in that coastal population, while inland populations don't eat those banana slugs. And ultimately, there's not a lot of banana slugs in that inland habitat. So since there's not a lot of banana slugs there, they are reliant on knowing that, hey, don't look for banana slugs. You have to look for other sources of food. So the two populations differ in their ability to detect and respond to specific odor molecules produced by the banana slugs, where those coastal ones are going to pick up on that. Those inland ones are not. So a small frequency of the snakes that colonize the coastal habitats may have had this ability, or they had a slight variation which allowed them to pick up on these. And we see that over many generations, the ability to recognize slugs as prey could have increased in the coastal population. So the ones that moved to the coastal areas or the coastal habitat had those genes, and over time they passed on. The ones that did have those genes were going to pass on those traits, and maybe somewhere along the way there was a mutation that made them even better at smelling out those banana slug odors, and the ones that had the mutation were more fit for that environment, and they were going to pass on that mutation over many, many generations. You see that these garter snakes, these coastal garter snakes, are going to evolve to be really fit for picking up on those banana slug odors. So this is where you see that over time, it's not just about, hey, genes make proteins and proteins are what build us up, build us up, but proteins are, or I'm sorry, genes are going to have an influence on everything that we do, and all those influence are going to react with or interact with the environment, and that's where we see that the genes are going to influence the evolution of an organism. So another example that they give you is that these black-capped birds that breed in Germany, in Africa, they also are going to, there's other ones that breed in the winter in Britain. So you have these two different populations and varying migratory patterns or movement patterns of these two birds. And under laboratory conditions, they saw that the migratory populations have different migratory behaviors. So the German population versus the um, um, Britain, or I'm sorry, the African population versus the Britain population are going to have different behaviors. So it's two different really sects of individuals, and it reflects genetic differences between the population. There has to be some underlying cause that these organisms are born, the ones that go to Africa are born, and the ones that go to Britain are born. And why is it that they just know to go in these different areas? Well, there's a genetic basis behind that. So when they do the study, they see that you have the ones that are going to be the British ones, and the ones that are going to be the German ones. So as you see that we start talking about altruism, all right, natural selection favors behavior that maximizes an individual's survival and reproduction. So these behaviors are often selfish. All right, we always think of them as being selfish, but there is this behavior that we talk about that is called altruism, which is being selfless. Now let me just, a lot of times professors will talk about, is there such thing as altruism? And this has been debated for a long time. Is there such thing as altruism? And one of the big examples that they used for a long time were the lemmings, and they saw that lemmings. They said lemmings threw themselves off of cliffs, and they killed themselves in order for the greater good of the population of the lemmings, and that's just not true. There's been numerous studies that have been done, and different claims as to what was going on in any footage or any data that was collected that showed that lemmings were throwing themselves off cliffs. I've heard people say that in a lot of the footage, I guess Disney was putting together this footage to show about these lemmings and their true altruism that was going on, and they were saying they were pushing them off, where you couldn't see that on the footage, that they were pushing them off the cliff. You could kind of see from the angle just that they were falling off the cliff. I've also read that in reality, what's going on is that the lemmings are so frantically looking for food, because there's so many of them, that they just happen to kind of fall off the cliff. But there's nothing to really back up this idea that they are throwing themselves off the cliff. If that were true, then those genes for throwing yourself off the cliff would quickly be weeded out, and that behavior just wouldn't happen anymore. But we do see instances where you are going to put others in a better position than maybe your own. But we see this typically where it's going to be, if you have, say, a family member involved, or someone that's part of your tribe, because you're looking to pass on your genes maybe through that family. So even though you can't pass on your own genes necessarily, those people in your family have similar genes, and like we said before, you want to pass on your genes. Well, if I can't pass on my own genes, maybe some of my genes that my sister has or my brother has, they can pass on some of those genes, and then I kind of serve my purpose in life by passing on my familial genes. But there's no true altruism being completely selfless. There's not going to be a gene for that because we would quickly weed that out. So it is important to be selfish. So, for example, under a threat from a predator, an individual Belding's ground squirrel, so you have a ground squirrel will make an alarm call to warn others, even though calling increases the chances that the caller is killed. Another example, you have in naked mole rat populations, non-reproductive individuals may sacrifice their lives, protecting their reproductive queen and kings from predators. So if you see in both of these examples, well, you have this Belding's ground squirrel, and they're not saying, "Hey, come kill me." They're just making the call, and the hope is that if there's young around, maybe some of them are this ground squirrel's young, um, that you're saving them, or so you're not saying, "Hey, kill me." You're just making this call, and then you're going to try to scurry away, and maybe you're increasing your chances of getting killed, and if you are increasing your chances of getting killed, you at least are allowing your offspring to survive. So you've served your purpose at that point. So you're not saying, "Hey, kill me. I want to be killed to save everyone else." You're really saying, "Hey, you know what? I'll go out on a limb and try to make this call or alarm the others in order to help the other squirrels to survive, because some of those squirrels have my genes in them as well. My offspring are going to have my genes. Maybe my siblings' offspring, my nieces and my nephews, they're going to have the genes as well. And I want them to be able to pass on their genes because I'm done passing on my genes. With this example with the mole rat population, you see that, well, where is it happening? In non-reproductive individuals. So as a non-reproductive individual, if you think about it like honeybees, where there are individuals that are not reproducing, well, you really want to make sure that your king and your queen are reproducing. So your purpose is to pass on the genes that are part of that that um, that population of individuals. And if you're a non-reproductive individual, then ultimately you have to protect the ones that are reproducing. So true altruism, being completely selfless and just killing yourself um, to help the greater good, to provide more food for others or anything like that, just not going to happen. But we do see these selfless acts where it kind of in a convoluted way is going to help pass on your genes. So here's a naked mole rat. They're very ugly. They don't really see the light of day too much, and they live underground. Um, so we have inclusive fitness, which is the total effect an individual has on proliferating its genes by producing offspring and helping close relatives produce offspring as well. So that's where you see, hey, look, not only do we want to make sure that we are producing offspring and viable offspring, but we want to make sure that our close relatives are doing so as well, because we share the same genes and we want to pass on our genes. So the evolution of altruistic behavior can be explained by this. And William Hamilton, he came up with this idea of looking at these quantitative measures, because we always, as much as we like to talk about the qualitative aspects of research and collecting data, we always want to turn it into quantitative. That's what scientists do. We like to make, and we like to have quantitative data. So he created this equation where he said, look, if we have to look at three variables in any altruistic act, you want to look at the benefit, you want to look at the cost, and then you want to look at the coefficient of relatedness. Okay, how related are you to an organism? And what he said was, well, look, you might say I'm sibling one. Okay, if I had a twin, I would have 100% of the same DNA or genes as my twin. Um, but if you look at a full sibling, they're only going to have about half, because your probability of getting, and this is just, this is an idea. It's not exactly half between one sibling and the next. I might share more with one sibling by a couple percentage points, maybe more with the other by a couple percentage points. But just as a general idea in a hypothetical um, scenario, if you're going to talk about, hey, we have these homologous chromosomes and they're being separated, and I'm getting half from my mother and half from the father, but I don't know which ones I'm getting from my mother. I don't know which ones I'm getting from my father. Well, when we're splitting up, yeah, I might for homologous chromosome one, maybe I have the same one as my sibling, but maybe on two, all right, I have a different one as my sibling. So with all the crossing over that's going to occur, and you have the separation of the chromosomes, we like to say that typically a good estimate would be that you're going to share about 50%. So being altruistic is going to be beneficial if I can help my sibling to pass on their genes, because hey, it might not be 100% of my genes, but it's still going to be a 50% probability. So what Hamilton's rule says is that you're going to have the benefit and the coefficient, they are going to be greater than the cost. So we need the coefficient and the benefit to be greater than the cost, or it just wouldn't make sense to be altruistic. So in order to have altruism, you need to have both the benefit and your coefficient to be greater than the cost. So Hamilton's rule is illustrated with the following example of a girl who risked her life to save her brother. All right, if you think about altruism in real life, a lot of people think about all the things that we do in order to help other people. You have social welfare programs and single payer healthcare. All these things are going to benefit individuals. Well, just in a plain sense, or a very simple sense, you're going to see that, hey, you know what, if a girl risks her life to save her brother, then you want to look at, was her doing this, is the benefit and the coefficient, meaning the how related she is to that sibling, is it greater than the cost in the scenario. So assume that the average individual has two children as a result of the sister's action. All right. The brother can now father two children, where you're going to have that the benefit is equal to two children. And the sister has 25% chance of dying and not being able to have two children. So you're going to have the cost is 0.25, 25% times 2. All right, that creates our 0.5. And the brother and the sister share half their genes on average. So your coefficient is going to be 0.5. Now, if the sister saves the brother, you're going to see that if we multiply the coefficient and the benefit together, it's going to give you a 1. And if you create your cost, and you look at your cost, you're going to see it is 0.5. So in this scenario, your benefit and your coefficient together is going to be greater than your costs. So because of the benefit coefficient is greater than the cost, in this case, natural selection should favor this altruistic act. Okay. If you then look again further at, hey, what if it involved a cousin, a second cousin, an uncle, a half brother? Now we're starting to play with the different numbers that are involved. What if we start looking at, all right, what are the chances of her getting hit by a car? All right, lower the chances, increase the chances. Then is going to change this scenario. And then maybe it is not going to favor this altruistic act, depending on what the numbers are. In this scenario, it did favor the altruistic act. Why? Because we kept our coefficient a benefit greater than our cost. So kin selection is the natural selection that favors this kind of altruistic behavior by enhancing the reproductive success of relatives. Remember, in this scenario, is it completely selfless? No, it is not completely selfless. You are trying to increase the reproductive success of your relatives. If it was someone we never met before, then there would be no connection. There would be no gene that could favor that behavior. So an example of the relationship between kin selection and altruism is that Belding's ground squirrel, where you're going to have that warning going on. Females settle close to their site of birth, whereas the The males settle at distant sites, and most alarm calls are given by females who are likely aiding close relatives. So those females are going to make those alarm calls, hoping that their offspring are going to survive by them doing so. Um, you see that naked mole rats are living within a colony or are closely related, so the non-reproductive individuals increase their inclusive fitness by helping the reproductive queen and kings to pass their genes to the next generation. So is it true altruism, completely selfless? No. So you have reciprocal altruism, where the altruistic behavior towards unrelated individuals can be adaptive if the aided individual returns the favor in the future. This type of altruism is going to be that reciprocal idea of selflessness, and it's limited to species with stable social groups where individuals meet repeatedly, and cheaters who don't reciprocate are punished. So you're going to see that in higher level mammals, typically, I would say, because you have to have that relatedness in those social groups that are going to really keep an eye on, I guess you could say, the rules of things. So does this happen to humans? Absolutely. So the tit for tat behavior, as you could think of it, tit for tat behavioral strategy explains how reciprocal altruism could have evolved, because there are a set of rules, and the rules are benefiting an individual in a way that can help them to pass on their genes. So individuals are always going to cooperate on the first encounter. An individual treats another the same way it was treated the last time they met. So um, obviously individuals that don't are going to be cheaters, and they have to be punished for that. So when we talk about evolution, human culture, due to our capacity for learning, humans are probably more able than any other animal to acquire new behaviors and skills. Like I said, mammals and much smarter organisms are going to, smarter lineages of organisms are really going to have these more complex types of reciprocal altruism that we're going to see. Humans are the best example because of our ability to learn and to really cooperate. So humans, if you ever hear about why have humans been, why, how do we make our way to be these I guess you could say, elite or apex kind of predators, and how we climb the food chain. Even though we fit in anywhere in the food chain, we're still eating um, um, consumers, and I'm sorry, we're still eating producers, still eat plants, stuff like that. But our ability to kind of survive and live in any environment, and really do anything, is our ability to cooperate, our ability to communicate, which other organisms are not nearly as good at as we have become. So human culture is, related to evolutionary theory in the discipline of sociobiology. So some of you could go on to study sociobiology. Excuse me. Human behavior like that of other species results from interactions between genes and environment. Same idea, but now you're talking about more complex kind of ideas involved with this. It's not so much this natural selection where are you going to be camouflaged or not, more camouflaged than the next, are you going to be able to compete. Now you're talking about the both social and cultural interactions that are going to occur, and these social and cultural institutions may provide the only feature in which there's no continuum between humans and other animals. So we see humans are a little bit different. With talking about these types of things, you have on the more complex organisms, you have imprinting that is also going on. So you can look at how does imprinting influence survival, cognition, all right, spatial learning, associated learning, social learning. All of these forms of learning and problem solving are what now create the intricacies of looking at behavior and evolution. So with sexual selection, um, it's a process in which individuals with certain inherited characteristics are more likely to acquire mates than other individuals of the same sex. So now you have organisms that are going to select which mate do they want. And we talked about in class, the biggest example of sexual selection that we love to talk about is birds. And birds show this sexual dimorphism where the males and the females don't look the same. And really the males have evolved to look very, very pretty because they need to, because they are the ones that are getting selected. It's up to the females to do the selecting. So in order for that to happen over a long time, the males have to get prettier and prettier and have nicer plumage, and the females, it's not as important to do so. For the females, that might be important for them to be able to make viable offspring. Here you have a peacock and a peahen, and the peahen gets to do the selecting and for the sexual selection, and the peacock has to look as pretty as possible. So over many generations, you see that these peacocks get bigger and prettier feathers over time. You have two different types of selection within that sexual selection. You have intrasexual selection, which is direct competition among individuals like males for mates. So you have that intrasexual selection. And then you have intersexual selection, often called mate choice, which occurs when individuals of one sex, usually like with birds, we're talking about females, are choosy in selecting their mates. So there's both of these things are going on at the same time and are influencing the overall picture of sexual selection. So showiness of male appearance can increase a male's chances of attracting a female while decreasing his chances of survival. So we do see that standing out is not going to help them, but it does help them to reproduce, and that's where you talk about your cost versus benefit idea. So in maintaining or balancing selection, balancing selection occurs when natural selection maintains stable frequencies of two or more phenotypic forms. So you see that there are two different forms in a population because natural selection allows that to be maintained within that population. And balancing selection includes frequency dependent selection, and then you have heterozygote advantage. And diploidy maintains that genetic variation in the form of recessive alleles hidden from selection in heterozygotes. So by being diploid organisms, by having two sets of chromosomes, you can now have these recessive alleles and you can hide them in heterozygotes, and then you can have you have homozygous recessive individuals, you have heterozygote individuals, and you have your homozygous dominant individuals, which now creates these different phenotypes and this kind of mixing of different genes throughout the generations. So when we talk about sexual reproduction, everyone always thinks, well, it's got to be better. Well, if it was completely better, we would probably see that there would be no more asexually reproducing organisms. But that's just not the case. It really depends on the scenario. You have asexually reproducing organisms that are alive today, doing just fine, thriving. So why did sexual reproduction come along? Well, the misconception is that there's no diversity within asexual reproducing organisms. There is diversity, and there are mutations that are going to occur, and there's still going to be variations in alleles within a population. But sexually reproducing organisms make sacrifices by having to coordinate production and find a mate. So it's not necessarily beneficial to be sexually reproducing, but we see that there are reasons to be sexually reproducing organisms. And the Red Queen hypothesis points to the idea that the benefits of sexual reproduction outweigh the costs of it in many situations. So you see with sexually reproducing organisms, it benefits them greatly by being able to evolve quickly. Okay, so you can evolve quickly because you're able to mix your genes during meiosis as well as crossing over, which is not going to happen in asexually reproducing organisms. And you see organisms with longer lifespans can keep up with those rapid changes that are occurring with organisms that reproduce asexually. So while the asexually reproducing organisms are constantly changing because they have short lifespans, you think about bacteria, they're going to reproduce every 8 hours. Well, we can't keep up with them if we're only reproduce. We live 80 years, we reproduce once during that time, or we only have one set of kids during that time. Well, how do we keep up with that? Well, now we have a way to keep up because we have this meiosis, we have this crossing over, and we have this mixing of our genes. So you're hoping that by mixing these genes, hopefully one of your offspring is going to have a beneficial trait, have the beneficial trait, and even if all your other offspring don't survive, you were able to make one offspring that was able to survive and live long enough to pass on their traits, and they passed on that beneficial trait, and over time it helps us to compete and really stay alive and evolve quick enough to keep up with the asexual reproducing organisms that have short lifespans. So the environment is able to act on the alleles to select which ones are fit, and asexually reproducing organisms could be doomed in certain situations.